may have noticed the last couple of years, there seems to be an increased interest in the biblical stories, especially the book of Genesis. You have secular people like Jordan Peterson, who has hours and hours and hours of lectures on Genesis online, and it's accumulated tens of millions of views. I think young people especially we're seeing them taking new interest in the biblical stories. Why is that? Well, it turns out that we need a story, that stories are important, that we need to know that there is a story. We need to know that we play a role in a story. Stories help us to know, they allow us to have meaning and purpose, right? Without a story, without a vision for life, it's difficult to flourish. You just think of the power of stories and how stories captivate us, and how you can sit down and watch and binge watch a series on Netflix, your favorite TV show, and it can just be, you're just getting enthralled with the story, the narrative, and you find yourself even putting yourself in the story, putting yourself into the narrative. And as we become less and less religious and more atheistic, there's been an inability to provide a compelling story. And what that's resulted to is a crisis a meaning crisis. And we see that meaning crisis being played out throughout our culture in spades. And I think that's the reason why we have this increased return to the interest of these stories of Genesis. And the reality is that as we hear from the book of Genesis here today, these are inspired by God, and they give us, these stories give us the deepest insights into human life. Specifically, this little snippet of Genesis chapter 3 that we see that sin is part of our story, and we see that sin is dealt with and how it's dealt with. So to say first that sin is part of our story is to get to the doctrine of original sin. And the doctrine of original sin is, because the fall of Adam and Eve, sin entered the world. And now everybody born, although we're born in the image of God, we're born broken. We're born with evil, with evil in us. You know, I think as moderns, we have an especially hard time accepting this, of like, maybe this seems to be it's not fair. And increasingly so, really beginning with the Enlightenment, there's been a rejection of the doctrine of original sin. The Enlightenment's kind of wanted to do away with the fact that man and woman were born with sin in us. So they said that no, man is born good, and it's society and institutions that are bad that makes man bad. So what we've got to do is we've got to try to create and reform the institutions, societies, so as to make this utopia, so as to return man back to its good state. Chesterton was one who looks at this and says, trying to reject the doctrine of fall, he says the doctrine of fall is one of the Christian doctrines that can be easily empirically proven. Just look around. And I had that Chesterton quote in my mind, and the story of Genesis here that we hear from, and trying to think about how to explain the consequences of sin and the brokenness in the world. And I just kept thinking of cicadas. Okay? Cicadas. I started off thinking cicadas starting off being annoyed by them. And then with the school kids at recess, you see them playing with them and picking them up and making playhouses, cicada hotels. They pick them up, they pet them, you see them kissing the cicadas. So I got to think, the kids got me thinking and helped me think that cicadas are, the creation of God. It helps to see how, just God and his magnificence, and even in cicadas, it's helped me appreciate the cicadas. That lasted a day, right? And then it's back to, increasingly so it seems, cicadas sticking on your clothes, and then you enter the house with them. Deacon Christian had a cicada in his hoodie the other day, and then in the rectory, one of the servers at the earlier masses had a cicada inside his cassock in between his clothes. I even heard a cicada during the first reading somewhere back there. Seems to me cicadas easily, empirically prove the doctrine of original sin, the brokenness. But we don't need cicadas to prove original sin. We see the brokenness all around. And really, all we have to do is we take an honest look within our own hearts, and we note the tension that's within us. We know we can see at times the ugliness that's there. And it's, in a way, we see, because sin is part of the story, because it's part of original sin, part of our story, it gives an answer to the brokenness. Francis de Sales once said, he goes, "Why are you surprised when the weak turn out to be weak? Why are you surprised when the frail turn out to be frail? Why are you surprised when you turn out to be sinful?" We oftentimes say about ourselves, like I hear in the confessional a lot, people say, "Man, I can't believe I did that." Really? See, that sin is part of our story. Original sin, it provides an answer of why sometimes I say the things that I say, or why sometimes I do the things that I do. A result of the original sin is concupiscence. That is our tendency to do evil. We're inclined, and we find it easier to do evil than good. It's like two paths forward, that taking and doing good is like taking the uphill path, and doing bad is taking the downhill path. We find it, we're inclined to do evil. And knowing that it's part of our story too, sin, knowing that sin's part of our story, it frees you from thinking that you can perfect yourself. Like you have a thought in your mind of like, man, if I reach to be him in 5 years, like this, then I'll finally have arrived, and like my problems will, like I'll finally be satisfied with myself. The reality is, a better version of you will not solve what has gone wrong in you. It doesn't solve what is broken of us being born with our will being bent. And it should play a part, the fact that sin is part of our story for parents, right? It teaches you that your child's sinfulness isn't just a result of mistakes that you've made as a parent. Like you just think like you could have, like even if somehow you'd made all the right parenting choices at every moment along the way, your child would still be a sinner. The best raised child will still be fallen, because sin is part of our story. And that should lead to compassion, gentle with ourselves, right? St. Francis de Sales continues with that quote. He says, "When you fall, be gentle with your frail, weak heart. Lift your heart gently. Accept your failure without wallowing in your weakness. Admit your guilt in God's sight." What did Adam and Eve do? They ran, they hid, they covered themselves in shame. St. Francis Sales says, the move to make is to admit your guilt in God's sight. Then with good heart, with courage and confidence in his mercy, start over again. Compassion toward ourselves, compassion with others, because whatever it is, whoever does, they have in them what you have in you. We're all in the same boat because of what happened when we read in Genesis. We're all in the same boat. Sin is part of our story. But we're not going to leave us there, because the story doesn't end there. Even in this little snippet in Genesis chapter 3 that we hear in their first reading, we also see how sin is dealt with. and sin is dealt with. Moments after the rebellion of Adam and Eve in the garden, the Lord called out to the man and said, "Where are you?" And he comes and searches to look for him, to bring him back. That first indication that he's coming. Then he speaks directly to the serpent. In verse 15, we heard, he says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. And he," Jesus, the one who's coming, "shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So that is to say, the one who's coming, he's going to stomp on your head. And he's going to crush and destroy sin and death and put an end to it. But in the process of it, you will snap at his heel, which is the cross. Just to close with an illustration on this, some of you who are mystery novel lovers probably familiar with Dorothy Sayers. Dorothy Sayers was one of the first women to graduate from Oxford, and she wrote detective fiction novels. And of her most famous detective novels was based on a character, Lord Peter Wimsey. The series called Lord Peter Wimsey, and Peter Wimsey was a detective himself, and he solved these crimes. And he was an aristocrat. He was wealthy, but he was lonely and single. And halfway through the Peter Wimsey novels, a woman suddenly shows up in the novel, and her name is Harriet Vane. And Harriet Vane, this character in the novel, just so happened to be one of the first women who graduated from Oxford. And she just so happened to be a writer of detective fiction. And her and Peter meet, and they solve mysteries together. And they fall in love. And they live happily ever after. Before Harriet Vane character showed up in the novel, Peter Wimsey was an unhappy, broken bachelor. And Harriet Vane shows up, and her love starts to heal this broken soul. See, Dorothy Sayers, the author of the story, looked into her own world that she created and looked in on this character that she created, and saw that he was lonely. She saw the pain of the man that she had created, and she loved him. She fell in love with him, this character that she created. And what she did is she wrote herself into the story. She saw that Peter Wimsey was a man who was broken, he was alone, and he was a man who needed someone to save him. And she wrote herself into the story to save Peter Wimsey. God created the world. The human race in which he created turned away from him and rebelled, and in entered the picture is sin and brokenness and pain. And God looks into the world, and he loves us. And he wrote himself into the story. And not only that, it's even far more beautiful than that, because he knows our particular stories. Maybe especially the part of our stories in which, like this part of my story, I wish it wasn't part of my story. I've got shame that this is part of my story. And the Lord looks at it and says, I know those parts of the story in which that you have shame, that you try to cover up and you run and you hide. But it's those exact parts of the stories are the whole reason why I wrote myself into the story. So as to redeem you, so as to reconcile you to the Father and give you new life and to save you. It's why I came. See, we need a story. People are dying out there to be part of a story. Well, there is a story. Sin is part of it, and it's ugly. It causes a mess. But what is also part of the story is hope and redemption. So don't run and hide from him, because hope and redemption and peace of soul can be had. Because the author wrote himself in the story to save, to rescue, and to redeem.